Welcome. I'm Larry Taylor. Thank you for joining me. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we've just finished up with chapter 6. We ended at verse 26. And in that paragraph just previous to that ends at verse 26, um, Jesus is warning us about the dangers of wealth. Luke's gospel records Jesus saying even more about how dangerous wealth is. When we go over to Luke's gospel, for example, Jesus warns us that wealth strangles spiritual maturity. Tells us that in chapter 8, Luke chapter 8, verse 14. He warns us that wealth produces anxiety. We've seen that here in the Sermon on the Mount. We also see it in Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 22 and following. Jesus warns us that wealth blinds us to the needs of others. That's so true, isn't it? We, in our modern culture, tend to live in these little uh, economic bubbles. Everyone around us is basically the same economic level we are. We're not living with poor people unless we are poor people. We're not having poor people eat dinner with us on a regular basis. We're not doing life with people who are poor. And the wealthier you get, the more isolated you get. You live in your enclave, surrounded by more and more opulence and more wealth. And it blinds us to the needs around us. It's not that we are dispassionate, it's not that we don't care, it's that we don't even notice. We never see any homeless people, we never see any poor people, we don't know what it's like to try to make a living on support a family on minimum wage. I have friends, for example, who are working. Um, in fact, I'm thinking of a couple of friends who have two, three jobs, all part time, all minimum wage, no benefits, and they can just barely pay their rent every month. And they have to rely on the schools to feed their children breakfast and lunch. And you can imagine working jobs like that, and you don't own a car, and you're getting on the bus to go from one to the next, and it's taking you hours to get there. And by the time you get home, you're exhausted, and then you have to make dinner and serve the children and try to help them with their homework and clean up. And then you collapse into bed, and the whole thing starts all over again. I know people who do that 7 days a week, who never have a day off. They have no vacation, they have no paid sick leave. Um, in the middle of a pandemic, of course, now we're mandated to be socially distant from one another, but even prior to that, um, people are regularly told, look, if you're sick, don't come to work. Well, that's easy to say if you have a job that provides sick days and you're still getting an income. But if you're someone like these friends that I just mentioned, you don't go to work, you don't get any money. And so they drag themselves to work sick, and they drag themselves to work tired, and life becomes just a grind. Wealth blinds us to that sort of thing. Wealth, Jesus tells us, is extremely dangerous. Jesus warns us that wealth strangles our spiritual maturity because it shuts down generosity. Remember that glorious principle in the Old Testament called Jubilee. And interestingly enough, there's not any evidence that I've ever seen that the Jews actually practiced Jubilee. It appears to be a commandment of God that was never done. Or if it was, it dropped out of being done very, very early on. Perhaps they practiced it once or twice way back at the beginning, but it quickly fell out of favor. Remember what Jubilee was? The idea was that every 50 years there would be a year of Jubilee. And on the year of Jubilee, all debts were forgiven, completely forgiven. And any land that had been sold over the last 50 years, um, sold out of, the family was on hard times, and so they had to sell off a piece of their land. Um, it all returned to the original family. So nobody really owned anything because everybody owned everything. And there was equity. There was an equality of income and wealth across the whole society, was the idea. Debts forgiven, land returned, everything put back the way it's supposed to be, evened out. That's the way the early Christians lived. They held all things in common. They realized the dangers of wealth, and so they took their wealth and they put it in a common um, bucket and appointed godly people to watch over it and distribute it as needed. And they just trusted that all needs were going to be met. So nobody was wealthy and nobody was poor. Wealth, according to Luke, according to Jesus in Luke, is dangerous. It's dangerous because it strangles our spiritual maturity. It takes us away from that principle of Jubilee, that principle of generosity. It keeps us spiritually small. Wealth is dangerous because it produces anxiety. We worry about it. We gather all this stuff and then we worry about it. We have our investments and then we worry all the time, checking them and manipulating them. And Jesus doesn't want us to live like that. Wealth is dangerous because it blinds us to the needs of others. Wealth is dangerous because it leads us away from God, according to Luke chapter 13. You cannot serve God and mammon. We keep trying to do that. So many of us keep trying to do that, but it's impossible to do successfully. You can't be double-minded like that. Your eye isn't single anymore. Your body is full of darkness instead of light. You have to be focused on God, and part of being focused on God is to have a Jubilee-like attitude, an attitude that is generous and that is giving and that is not in any way clinging to material things. It's the exact opposite of what we are taught in North America. We are such a consumerist society. We're driven by things. We've built our temples to consumerism. We keep buying and wasting and throwing out, and things break down and things are manufactured purposely so they will break down so that we have to buy more stuff. And we worry and fret over it. And we spend all our time and effort collecting things, and then we spend our weekends cursing those things because they don't work properly. We need to live simple lives. We need to live generous lives. The whole purpose of living a simple life is so that now it frees up resources so I can be generous, so I can be more generous, so that I can help other people. I don't need to live in a house that's bigger than what I need. I don't need to drive a fancier car than what I need to get around. I don't need extravagance. I don't need to waste. I can learn to live a simple life so that I can practice Jubilee, so that I can be generous. Wealth is dangerous. It leads us away from God. And finally, in the book of Luke, Jesus tells us that wealth is many times actually a curse. He tells us that in Luke chapter 6. Let me turn there and read that passage, if I can find it here quickly. Luke chapter 6. Jesus is here sharing the Sermon on the Plain, and his statements are similar to what he shares in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, which is what we're studying together. But there's some differences too. Notice that here in Luke chapter 6, he says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God." And then he says, down in verse 24, "Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." Being rich, we think it's a blessing. No, it's a curse. God wants our needs to be met, certainly. God promises to meet our needs. That's the next section of the Sermon on the Mount that we'll get to in probably our next study together in Matthew chapter 6. But wealth, opulence, materialism, consumerism, the accumulation of stuff, that's a curse. Woe to you who are rich. You've already received your consolation. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Now, here in Luke chapter 6, Jesus is not talking about people who are poor in spirit, as he does over in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. But instead, he is talking here in Luke about those who are materially poor. Now, he's not saying that it's a blessing to not be able to pay your rent or not be able to put food on your table or to have to work 3 part-time jobs with no benefits in order to barely scrape by, only to be tossed out in the street by a landlord who's trying to help gentrify the neighborhood. He's not saying that that's a good thing. He's saying that when we live simple lives, just getting by on as frugally as we possibly can, it allows us to practice Jubilee and to be generous of heart, to be a blessing to others, to even the playing field, to take a step towards economic justice. We start recognizing that poverty kills people and that we can do something about that. We can live generous, simple lives, generous lives, Jubilee lives, and be a part of the solution rather than part of the problem.